I grew up in a place where the land carried the weight of generations, where every fence post and tree line meant something, and where property wasn't just property, it was a record of who came before you. My family's land stretched farther than my boyhood eyes could take in. There were old oak groves that turned fiery red in the fall, rolling pastures that glowed green after spring rains, and a creek that wound like a silver ribbon down through the fields. It was the kind of place that shapes a person's bones, where silence had a richness to it, and where work was stitched into the soil itself. But time has a way of pulling people away from where they began. After my father passed, and later my mother, the land became tangled in legal papers, inheritance disputes, and the kind of quiet bureaucratic red tape that makes you want to turn away from what should feel sacred. I left for a while, chasing work in the city, trying to find my own footing. The land wasn't forgotten, but it wasn't present either. It was just a weight at the back of my mind, tucked away behind bills, rent, and a daily grind that left little room for nostalgia. Years slipped by faster than I realized. The seasons I used to count by the way the trees changed and the creek swelled turned into years measured by deadlines, paychecks, and city blocks. I told myself I'd go back one day, that I'd stand in those fields again and breathe the clean air. That always seemed sharper and more honest than the smog I lived in now. But promises to yourself are easy to break when the world keeps piling new obligations in your lap. Then, one spring, a letter arrived in the mail that dragged the land back into my present reality. It wasn't from a lawyer or the county office, like I might have expected. It was from a real estate agent who claimed to be representing the local homeowners association. That line alone felt like a slap in the face. An HOA on my family's land. The words didn't even fit together. In my mind, I grew up with neighbors you waved it from your truck and whose kids showed up at your door asking for sugar or help fixing a bike chain. Nobody ever needed a committee with a clipboard to tell them how short their grass should be or what color their house was allowed to be. I set the letter aside, unsettled but not yet alarmed. I figured maybe it was some mix-up. Maybe they were talking about land nearby or some newly built subdivision stretching in the direction of my family's property. But when I pulled out the old survey maps and compared the parcel numbers, the chill set in. They were writing about my land, my inheritance. The boundaries matched. The creek, the oak grove, the pasturette was all mine. And yet, somehow, there was an HOA claiming to manage it. That realization left me staring out my apartment window at a skyline that suddenly felt even more foreign than usual. I'd been gone too long. While I was away, someone had put their boots down on my soil, hammered in posts that weren't theirs, and claimed a right they didn't own. The next week, I drove out there. My car hummed over long stretches of highway that seemed to pull me back in time, until the skyscrapers and glass storefronts gave way to silos, barns, and weathered farmhouses. With every mile, my pulse beat harder. I didn't know what I'd find, but I expected to see the land quiet, waiting. What I didn't expect was to come around the bend and see rows of brand new wooden cabins standing on what used to be open pasture. They were lined up neat as dominoes, with gravel drives and decorative lanterns by the doors. Brand new construction. The smell of lumber still clinging to the air. It looked like some kind of retreat, the kind of place where city folks would spend money to pretend they were living the rural life for a weekend. And sure enough, cars with out-of-state plates dotted the gravel lots, shiny SUVs with roof racks and bikes strapped to the back. Strangers were sitting on porches that didn't belong there, sipping drinks and taking in the view like it was theirs. The sight hit me in the gut. My land, the very soil my grandfather had plowed, now carved up into tidy vacation rentals. The oak grove where my father used to rest in the shade was fenced off with a cheap private property sign that wasn't put there by me. The creek had hammocks strung along its banks as if it were nothing more than a selling point in a glossy brochure. I sat in my car for a long time, parked on the dirt shoulder, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I wasn't just angry. I was betrayed. This wasn't a mistake. This was a takeover. While I'd been away, too busy and too trusting, someone had seen an opening and taken it. And they hadn't just taken, they'd built 20 cabins. A whole operation. This wasn't some neighbor grazing a few cows over the line. This was deliberate, organized, and bold. The thing about rural land is that it doesn't disappear. Even when you turn your back on it, it's still there, waiting. But if you're not careful, other people will move in and start writing their own story on top of yours. That's what the HOA had done. They'd written their story over mine, without asking, without acknowledging, and with the arrogance of thinking I wouldn't come back. For days after, I couldn't shake the images from my mind. Every time I tried to focus on work, I saw those cabins. Every time I lay down at night, I thought of strangers' footsteps across ground that should have been silent and untouched. The oak grove, the creek, the pastures, they haunted me. And underneath that frustration was something even stronger, a sense of duty. This wasn't just about property. It was about my family, my father's calloused hands, my mother's steady presence, my grandfather's grit. They hadn't held on to that land for generations, just for me to let it slip away because some HOA waved around a clipboard and smiled their smug, suburban smiles. I started digging. Old deeds, county records, inheritance papers. It wasn't glamorous work, and it pulled me into a world of dusty files and grainy photocopies. But each document I found was like a breadcrumb leading me back to the truth. The land was still mine. The legal ties hadn't been broken. Somewhere along the way, paperwork had been ignored or conveniently misplaced, and the HOA had taken advantage of my absence. The more I uncovered, the more my anger transformed into resolve. I realized that what I held in my hands wasn't just paper, it was leverage, proof, receipts in the truest sense of the word. They might have built cabins. They might have drawn up their own rules, their tidy little regulations about paint colors and fence heights. But beneath all of that, beneath every plank of wood and every gravel path, the land still belonged to me. That knowledge changed everything. The fury in me settled into something colder, steadier. A fire banked not to burn out, but to burn long. I knew then that this wasn't just going to be about reclaiming what was mine. It was going to be about teaching them a lesson in arrogance, about showing them that no matter how many rules and bylaws they waved around, the ground under their feet didn't answer to them. As I sat with the documents spread across my kitchen table, the city lights blinking through the window, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. The land had called me back, and I had answered. They thought I was gone, that I'd forgotten, that I'd abandoned what was rightfully mine. But they were wrong. I was back, and I had receipts, and in time they would learn exactly what that meant. When I first laid eyes on those cabins, I thought the shock alone might stop my heart. But the shock gave way to something else, a gnawing curiosity about how the HOA had pulled it off. They hadn't just trespassed or mowed over my fields. They had built 20 cabins, each uniform yet dressed up to look rustic, as if authenticity could be bought at a hardware store and nailed onto a frame. It wasn't just a rogue builder or a careless neighbor. This was organized. It had the fingerprints of bureaucracy all over it. That was when I realized this wasn't just about construction. It was about control. The HOA hadn't stumbled into my land. They had claimed it, sectioned it off, and written their own laws as if they owned it. They treated it like a sandbox they could dig their hands into, reshaping it to suit their suburban vision. And they hadn't stopped at the cabins. The more I drove around, the clearer it became. Signs had sprouted up along the dirt road that once only my family traveled. Wooden posts with freshly painted placards. Private HOA property. Members only. At the creek, where my father once watered cattle, there was now a boardwalk with benches bolted down and a rule board instructing visitors where they could and couldn't swim. By the oak grove, where my grandfather once stacked firewood, a gated recreation area had been established, complete with a padlock that gleamed like a dare in the sunlight. It wasn't just a matter of strangers using the land, was strangers imposing their order, stamping their rules onto a place that had thrived without them for centuries, where I had grown up knowing the natural rhythms of the soil and seasons. They had arrived with their regulations. No open fires. Quiet hours after 10 p.m. Trash must be bagged and disposed in designated bins. They wrote there restrictions on signs and nailed them into the earth as if they could overwrite history with white paint and cheap lumber. And the cabins got. The cabins. Each one stood about the same size, with tidy porches and matching railings. But the sameness was what made them offensive. The pasture where wildflowers once tangled freely had been leveled, replaced by gravel driveways and parking spaces neatly marked by white lines. The randomness, the rugged beauty, the stubborn wildness of the land had been scraped away to fit into their suburban mold. They hadn't just taken space, they had taken spirit. The HOAs treated my inheritance like it was. Theirs to curate, theirs to polish, theirs to sell. And sell it they did. Flyers littered the bulletin boards in town. Rustic getaway cabins managed by Pine Creek HOA. I picked one up and studied it in the fluorescent light of a gas station. There was a glossy photo of the cabins lined up against the backdrop of my oak grove, the creek in the distance. They advertised hiking, fishing, and community-managed facilities. The words community-managed stuck in my craw. What community? Their community. Because it sure as hell wasn't mine. The cabins weren't empty either. I drove past in the evenings and saw porch lights glowing, people grilling on decks, laughter echoing across the pastures that once knew only the quiet hum of crickets. They came with their coolers, their Bluetooth speakers, their branded folding chairs, and they treated the place like it was a theme park. It was no longer land to them, it was an amenity, something to be used, consumed, and discarded. It stung deeper than I expected. This wasn't just about legal ownership. It was about respect. My family had lived here with humility, working the ground, taking from it only what we needed, and leaving the rest for tomorrow. The HOA treated it like a product, slapping a price tag on memories and selling them to the highest bidder. At first, wondered how they even had the nerve. How? Did they justify it to themselves? But then I remembered what kind of organization I was dealing with. An HOA is built on entitlement, the belief that they know best, that their rules are the only rules worth following. It didn't surprise me that they'd apply that same thinking on a larger scale. They had extended their reach, deciding that if they could control lawns and paint colors, why not entire acres of land? And the town enabled them. I saw the signs literally. Business owners had flyers on their windows advertising the cabins. Locals welcomed the influx of visitors. The money trickling in from out-of-towners who rented kayaks, bought bait, and ate at the diners. Nobody stopped to ask whether the land was truly the HOA's to manage. To them, it was just progress. The old land, once overlooked, had been turned into revenue. What they didn't see was the theft underneath it all. They didn't see my father's sweat, my mother's sacrifices, my grandfather's endurance. They didn't see the inheritance written into deeds and records. They only saw what the HOA wanted them to see: shiny cabins, orderly spaces, and the promise of cash registers ringing. The HOA had even published their own bylaws regarding the cabins. I found a copy tucked in the flyer, listing rules about rentals, noise, parking, and even maintenance fees. Maintenance fees for a property that wasn't theirs. They had set up a system where outsiders would pay to rent cabins, and the HOA would pocket the fees as if they were legitimate landlords. They spoke of common spaces like the oak grove and creek, designating them as shared amenities for cabin users. I read the bylaws in disbelief, flipping through the pages. Under the dome light of my car, they had structured the theft into an institution. Every word was a reminder that they believed themselves untouchable. And perhaps the worst part was the smug confidence with which they operated. Every cabin was occupied. Every weekend, more visitors arrived. The HOA had held ribbon-cutting ceremonies, photo ops, and community days where they invited locals to see the cabins. They painted themselves as visionaries, as if they had breathed life into forgotten land instead of stealing it from under its rightful owner. But I saw through it, standing on the edge of the pasture one evening, watching a group of strangers light citronella candles on their porch. I felt a heaviness settle on me. This wasn't just about structures, was about erasure. They were erasing my history, my claim, my inheritance. If I did nothing, those cabins would root themselves into permanence. 10 years from now, people would forget the land had ever belonged to anyone else. The oak grove wouldn't be my grandfather's anymore, it would be the HOA's recreational space. The creek wouldn't be where I learned to skip stones, it would be marketed as exclusive waterfront access. The arrogance was staggering. They assumed I was gone. They assumed no one would notice. They assumed that paperwork could be shuffled, signatures could be lost, and the land would be absorbed into their playground without consequence. They assumed wrong, because while they wrote their bylaws and collected their fees, I was quietly stacking proof. Every deed, every survey, every tax record was another nail in the coffin of their illusion. My hands itched with the need for justice, but I knew better than to rush. If they wanted to play by rules, then I would play too, but I'd play smarter. I realized then that this story wasn't going to end with me simply reclaiming my land. That would be too easy. No, this story was going to end with me dismantling the very arrogance that allowed them to build in the first place. I wasn't just going to take back what was mine, I was going to make them regret ever stepping foot on my soil. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the porch lights of the cabins flickered on like false stars, I turned my back on the scene. The HOA had turned my inheritance into their playground. They believed they were in control, but they hadn't counted on me, and soon enough, their playground would come crashing down around them. The night I realized the scope of what the HOA had done, I couldn't sleep. The image of those cabins pressed down on me like a weight. Every creak of the floorboards in my apartment, every hum of the refrigerator felt too loud, too sharp. My mind kept circling the same question. How could they possibly believe they owned what was mine? And more importantly, how was I going to prove them wrong? I'd grown up knowing that land wasn't just measured in acres. It was measured in paperwork, in signatures, in stamps from county offices. My father used to say, "The land remembers, but the law needs proof." At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. But now, those words rang in my ears. If I was going to reclaim my inheritance, I couldn't rely on memory or sentiment. I needed to arm myself with records, with the kind of ironclad evidence that not even the slickest HOA board could wriggle out of, so I began. The first step was digging through what I already had. In a weathered cedar chest at my mother's old house, I found a folder marked property. The papers inside smelled faintly of mildew, the ink faded, the edges curling with age. Deeds, tax receipts, boundary service, each one a thread tying me back to the land. I spread them out across the kitchen table, weighing down the curling corners with coffee mugs and salt shakers. Some documents went back nearly a century, when my grandfather had purchased adjoining parcels to expand the farm. His signature, scrawled in looping cursive, still carried authority even through faded ink. The records painted a clear picture. The land was passed down legally, generation to generation. No sales, no transfers, no leases. The property was intact, whole, untouched in the eyes of the law. Which meant one thing: the HOA had built their empire on sand. Still, I knew better than to trust only what was in my possession. Paper could be contested, claimed as outdated, dismissed as irrelevant. If I wanted leverage, I needed official records. So I drove to the county courthouse, its brick facade and creaking steps as familiar as an old neighbor. Inside, the smell of paper and dust hit me like a time capsule. The clerks barely looked up when I asked for property archives. To them, it was routine. To me, it was war. I spent hours hunched over microfilm readers, scrolling through reels of old property ledgers. My eyes ached, my fingers stiffened, but with every record I uncovered, my case grew stronger. Parcel maps, tax rolls, inheritance filings, all with my family's name stamped across them. Not once did the HOA appear in any official capacity. They had no rightful claim. The more I found, the more incredulous I became. How had they managed to build 20 cabins without anyone raising a question? The answer revealed itself in zoning records. I discovered that years ago, the HOA had filed for permits on land adjacent to HOA boundaries. That vague phrase seemed harmless at first glance, but when paired with my absence and the county's lax oversight, it became the loophole they exploited. They blurred lines, shifted survey markers, and filed paperwork with enough legalese to scare off casual scrutiny. And because I wasn't there to defend my claim, nobody bothered to challenge it. It was audacious. They had drawn their borders like children scribbling with crayons, then marched into my inheritance as if boldness alone could make it theirs. But audacity without legitimacy crumbles under the weight of proof. I had proof in spades. By the third week of digging, I had assembled a mountain of evidence. Copies of deeds from 3 generations, tax receipts showing continuous payments under my family's name, historical maps confirming boundary lines, even aerial photos taken by the county decades ago, showing the land untouched without a trace of the cabins that now scarred it. Each piece fit together like a puzzle, the picture unmistakable. The land was mine, legally and unequivocally. Yet, evidence alone wasn't enough. I needed leverage, something that wouldn't just reclaim my land, but dismantle the HOA's smug confidence. That's when I discovered the financial angle while combing through county records. I found that the HOA had applied for special tax breaks by designating the cabins as community nude amenities. They claimed the cabins weren't rentals, but part of a shared recreational facility. That lie saved them thousands in taxes each year. But in reality, they were advertising the cabins as short-term rentals, charging nightly rates. They weren't just trespassing, they were defrauding the county. The realization made my blood run cold. This wasn't a simple boundary dispute anymore. This was fraud, plain and simple. Fraud that could bankrupt them if exposed. I dug deeper, tracking the HOA's finances through public records and local filings. They had collected maintenance fees from cabin renters, funneling the money into their general budget. They listed expenses for landscaping, waste management, even cabin upkeep. But nowhere in the filings did they disclose that the land didn't legally belong to them. In fact, they'd presented it as their asset in several reports. It was the smoking gun I didn't know I needed. Not only could I prove ownership, but I could also show that the HOA had enriched itself by renting out property it didn't own. It wasn't just a matter of me taking back what was mine. It was a matter of them paying for every dime they'd stolen. The knowledge filled me with a strange kind of calm. For weeks, my anger had been raw, burning hot, threatening to consume me. But now it cooled into something sharper. Strategy. I wasn't just the heir of the land. Annie Marai was the one holding the blade over their empire. At night, I'd sit at the kitchen table. The documents spread before me, a lamp casting long shadows across the paper. I thought about my father, who had warned me that land fights were never simple. He had once battled with a neighbor over a misplaced fence and nearly lost an acre because of a poorly worded deed. He would have understood the gravity of what I was facing now. But he also would have smiled at the stack of proof I'd gathered. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that the HOA's foundation was paper thin. They thrived on intimidation, on the assumption that no one would challenge them. Most people bent under their rules because the fight seemed too exhausting. But I wasn't most people. I had history on my side. I had the patience of generations. In my blood, one evening, I drove back to the land. I parked on the ridge overlooking the cabins, the oak grove standing in silhouette against the fading light. From my vantage point, I watched the activity below, porch lights flickering on, smoke rising from a grill, the faint echo of laughter carried by the wind. To anyone else, it might have looked idyllic. To me, it was a lie. A house of cards waiting for a gust to topple it. And I was the storm gathering on the horizon. I stayed there until the stars pricked the sky. The documents heavy in the seat beside me. Each crinkled page, each notarized signature was more than proof. It was leverage. The HOA had built their playground on stolen ground, and now I held the receipts to expose them. As I drove back into town, a quiet certainty settled over me. The time for mourning the land was over. The time for action was coming. Soon I'd step into their world of rules and regulations, not to play their game, but to end it. They thought I was gone. They thought the land was forgotten. But I was here. And I had everything I needed to remind them whose name was written in the soil. The first time I stood face to face with the HOA board, it wasn't in a courtroom, and it wasn't on my land. It was in their polished meeting hall, a place they treated like a seat of government. I remember walking in, my boots echoing against the linoleum floor, and seeing their banners draped across the walls. They had their logo plastered everywhere, pine trees circled by the words Pine Creek Homeowners Association. To them, it was a symbol of authority. To me, it was nothing more than a mask hiding theft. The hall smelled faintly of fresh paint and coffee. And everything about the room was designed to project order. Long tables lined in neat rows, a raised podium at the front, binders stacked with rules and bylaws. The board members sat with straight backs, dressed in their pressed polos and button-down shirts. They carried clipboards and laptops like weapons, their confidence palpable. This was their domain, their kingdom. And I was the intruder. But I didn't feel like an intruder, not anymore. I had come armed with something far stronger than their rules. I had deeds, surveys, tax receipts, and aerial photographs, saw the receipts they didn't expect anyone to produce. My inheritance was no longer a memory or a fading obligation. It was an ironclad fact, bound by signatures and seals, the kind of truth no HOA regulation could override. As I stood before them, I realized that the confrontation wasn't just about proving ownership. It was about shattering the illusion they had built. The cabins, the signs, the bylaws, they were nothing but a show. They thrived on intimidation, on people believing they had authority where they did not. And for months, maybe years, they had gotten away with it. But the moment I walked in with proof, their empire was already beginning to crack. I didn't speak loudly. I didn't need to. Instead, I laid the documents across their glossy table, one after another. Each deed, each tax receipt, each notarized boundary map landed like a hammer blow. Their eyes flickered over the papers, some squinting, others shifting uncomfortably. They tried to maintain composure, but I could see the cracks forming. They had built their case on assumptions, on the idea that no one would come forward to challenge them. But now, here I was, the rightful heir, and every piece of paper reminded them that they had overstepped. The silence in that hall was heavy, broken only by the faint rustle of pages as they skimmed the evidence. I didn't need to fill the space with words. The documents spoke louder than I ever could. In that moment, I realized something profound. They had power only because people believed they did. Their clipboards, their bylaws, their endless lists of fines and fees, it was smoke and mirrors. Against the weight of the law, against the permanence of recorded deeds. Their authority dissolved like mist in sunlight. Still, they weren't going to surrender easily. I could feel the resistance in their posture, the stiff set of their jaws. They had invested money, time, and pride into those cabins. To admit fault would mean financial ruin and personal humiliation. But pride doesn't override truth, and money doesn't erase ownership. I had them cornered, whether they wanted to admit it or not. The confrontation wasn't loud. It wasn't a shouting match or a dramatic standoff. It was quieter than that, more surgical. Every record I presented tightened the noose. Every tax receipt reminded them they had no legal claim. Every survey map underlined that they were trespassers. On land that was never theirs to touch. I watched the color drain from their faces one by one. The arrogance that had fueled their takeover gave way to something else: fear. Not just fear of losing the cabins, but fear of what would come next. Because I wasn't just an heir demanding recognition. I was someone with proof of fraud. Someone who could expose the way they had manipulated zoning laws, misled renters, and lied to the county for tax breaks. They weren't just dealing with a property dispute anymore. They were staring down the barrel of potential lawsuits, penalties, and public disgrace. That was the shift I'd been waiting for. For months, I had carried the weight of betrayal, the sting of seeing strangers lounging on my family's land. But in that room, the weight shifted. The burden no longer sat on my shoulders, sat on theirs. When the meeting ended, I walked out with my head high, the documents tucked back into my folder. The air outside felt sharper, cleaner, as though the land itself knew what had transpired, for the first time in years. I felt the balance tilt back toward justice. The confrontation didn't end in that hall, of course. Battles like this rarely do. What followed was weeks of back and forth. Letters from their lawyers, veiled threats, desperate offers to negotiate. They wanted to settle quietly, to keep their reputation intact. They spoke in the language of compromise. But I knew the truth: they weren't offering compromise out of generosity. They were offering it out of fear, and I wasn't interested in compromise. Each time a letter arrived, I added it to my growing stack of evidence. Each one painted them deeper into a corner. They admitted, in their own words, to managing cabins on land they could not prove they owned. They confessed, indirectly, to collecting rental income on property they had no rights to. Every desperate plea they sent only made my case stronger. The more they resisted, the more leverage I gained. I had already been prepared to reclaim the land legally, but now I held something far greater: the power to expose them publicly. The town that had embraced the cabins for their economic boost would not look kindly on fraud. The renters who had paid good money to stay there would not be pleased to learn they had been misled. And the county, once it realized it had been cheated out of tax revenue, would come down on them with a hammer. The HOA board had tried to turn my inheritance into their playground. Now they were learning that playgrounds can collapse when the ground beneath them isn't solid. I spent long evenings driving back out to the land, parking by the ridge, and watching the cabins from afar. I no longer looked at them with despair. Instead, I looked at them like a predator watches pre-com, patient, certain of the outcome. The porch lights glowed, The laughter drifted across the fields. But all of it felt temporary, like decorations on a stage about to be torn down. The oak grove stood tall in the distance, its branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. I thought of my grandfather, who had planted fence posts by hand, who had taught me to read the lay of the land by watching the shadows. He hadn't endured backbreaking work so that strangers could sit on porches built by arrogance. He had endured it so that the land would remain ours, preserved and respected, and soon it would be again. The confrontation had begun, and the HOA had shown their hand. They were not invincible. They were desperate. And I was the one holding the receipts that would bring them down. The board thought they could intimidate me with their polished hall, their clipboards, and their endless rules. But I had something they couldn't manufacture. I had truth, rooted in history, sealed in records, undeniable and unshakable. And in the end, truth is heavier than any clipboard. I knew the battle wasn't over yet. There would be filings, hearings, maybe even a courtroom showdown. But as I drove away from their hall that night, the headlights cutting through the darkness, I felt a sense of certainty I hadn't felt in years. The land was mine. The law said so. The history said so. And no amount of HOA arrogance could change that. They had underestimated me. They had underestimated the land. And soon they would learn that when you build on stolen soil, it doesn't matter how sturdy the walls are, the foundation will always collapse. Revenge doesn't always arrive with shouting or spectacle. Sometimes it comes quietly, through paper trails and signatures, through sealed envelopes and the slow turning of gears that grind arrogance into dust. By the time I reached the end of my fight with the HOA, I realized revenge didn't need to be lauded, just needed to be thorough. The board had grown desperate after that first confrontation. Their letters became more frequent, their offers more frantic. At first, they tried denial, insisting the cabins were community property. When that didn't work, they offered settlements, whispering through legal jargon about fair compensation. But every word they wrote only strengthened my position. I didn't want their money. I didn't want compromise. I wanted my land back, whole and unbroken. And I wanted their arrogance stripped away for everyone to see. So I turned the same system they had relied on against them. I began with the county. The evidence of fraud, the tax breaks claimed under false pretenses, the misclassification of the cabins was too sharp to ignore. I filed a formal complaint, attaching copies of the HOA's own financial reports alongside the deeds that proved ownership. Bureaucracy moves slow, but when it smells money slipping away, it starts to run. Within weeks, the county tax office launched an investigation. The ripples spread fast. Word traveled through town that the HOA might be facing penalties for fraud. For years, they had strutted around, writing citations for untrimmed hedges and miscolored shutters. Now the same neighbors they once fined watched with quiet satisfaction as the tables turned. The cabins that had been a symbol of progress became a mark of corruption. Next came the renters. I didn't need to say a word to them directly. All it took was one article in the local paper written after the county confirmed its investigation. The headline was simple: cabins built on disputed land. Ownership questioned. Suddenly, families who had booked their rustic getaway didn't want to be part of a scandal. Reservations dried up. Rash demands poured in. The HOA, once flush with cabin income, now found itself bleeding money. But the real blow came when I filed suit for trespass and unlawful enrichment. My lawyer, armed with a stack of receipts I had so carefully collected, laid out the case with precision. 20 cabins built without permission. Rental income pocketed under false claims. Tax fraud layered on top like icing. It wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was theft dressed up in paperwork. The HOA board, once smug behind their clipboards, was forced into the harsh light of a courtroom. There, stripped of their banners and bylaws, They were just individuals. Facing the weight of evidence, I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Watching them squirm under the judge's questions was satisfaction enough. The ruling came down, clear and sharp. The land was mine, the cabins were illegal, and the HOA was liable for damages. They were ordered to pay restitution, not only for the rental income but also for the years of unauthorized use. The cabins, once their pride and joy, were marked for removal unless I chose otherwise, and that was where my revenge took its final shape. I could have bulldozed the cabins out of spite. I could have left the wreckage as a reminder of their arrogance, but instead I chose something quieter, more enduring. I reclaimed them not as rentals, not as community property, but as part of my land. Their porches, their gravel drives. Their carefully painted railings, all of it, now stood as monuments to their failure. What they had built to symbolize control now stood as proof of their downfall. I walked through those cabins the day after the ruling, the air heavy with silence. The furniture was still there, the beds neatly made, the kitchen stocked with cheap utensils. It felt surreal, stepping into spaces crafted by hands that had no right to touch my soil. Yet now, each cabin belonged to me. Their mistake had handed me more than land. It had given me assets, leverage, and a story that would echo long after the dust settled. The HOA, once feared in the community, crumbled under the weight of scandal. Their board members resigned one by one, some vanishing from town altogether. Their meetings, once filled with self-importance, became empty halls. The neighbors who once endured their petty fines now spoke of them with contempt, shaking their heads at the arrogance that had led to their collapse. As for me, I stood again. In the oak grove, the wind rustling through the branches, sunlight dappling the ground. For the first time in years, I felt the land breathe easy. The soil was mine again, not just by inheritance, but by victory. And in that moment, I realized that revenge wasn't about destruction, was about restoration, restoring balance, restoring respect, restoring the rightful bond between land and the people who truly cared for it. The cabins still stood, but they no longer mocked me. They were reminders that arrogance can't outlast truth, that stolen soil will always call its owner home. Each nail, each board, each porch light was a testament to their failure. They thought they had erased my claim. Instead, they had carved my victory into the landscape. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to boast. The land itself told the story now. Anyone who walked through those cabins, anyone who rested by the creek or stood beneath the oaks, would know that they stood on ground reclaimed. And in that quiet, steady way, my revenge was complete. Because in the end, the HOA hadn't just lost a fight. They had been exposed, undone, and forgotten. Their playground had become my inheritance once more. Their arrogance had built me a monument to patience, persistence, and the power of receipts. The land was mine again. Not by gift, not by compromise, but by battle won. And I knew, as I stood with the soil beneath my boots and the weight of generations at my back, that they would never make the mistake of underestimating me or my land again.